Hello, friends. If you're curious about the movie Unfaithful 2002, you're in the perfect place. Don't forget to give this video a quick like, it really helps us out. And if you're new here, hit subscribe to stay updated on all the latest movie deep dives. Let's jump right in. Natalie and Edward live in suburban bliss, their days unfolding beneath a canopy of comfortable routines. He commutes to his real estate office, briefcase brimming with papers and promises. She drops by bookstores, greeting strangers with warm smiles as if every morning carries the fresh scent of possibility. Their home is a haven of artful photography, scattered stems of white roses in crystal vases, and walls painted a serene dove gray. It is the kind of place where bicycle rides and Sunday dinners feel sacred, where the welcome mat never gathers dust and the coffee pot is always ready to pour out hope. In the quiet expanse of their world, love pulses along in gentle rhythms, like the hum of a well-tuned engine on a calm afternoon. Yet in that hum lies a question no one asks aloud. Can the sweetest fruit ever remain untouched once temptation presses its finger to the rind? She glides through the halls of elegant boutiques, her slender fingers trailing the spines of rare art books while a storm of longing stirs within her. She meets a stranger one afternoon in an art gallery whose voice slides into her mind like a velvet invitation. Wry, confident, possessed of a hunger wild enough to match her own quiet discontent. He carries ideas like weapons, about desire, about risk, about the fragility of what they call forever. Their eyes lock over a black and white photograph of a nude dancer caught mid-twirl, and in that moment she feels a flicker of something lethal and intoxicating, as though her heart has been set alight by a single spark. She is already a devoted wife, already a mother, already a woman who has built her happiness on trust, but his presence unearths a secret yearning for something more, something forbidden. It is the heartbeat that pounds beneath every unspoken promise when night falls, and when they finally cross the threshold of courtesy into the territory of stolen kisses, the world shifts on its axis. He walks into her life simply, unannounced, a bookstore worker with tousled hair and eyes that hold stories she can't yet name. Their conversation begins with a question about a first edition she's been hunting, but by the time he steps aside to let her browse the next shelf, he has already become a ghost she cannot shake. She feels the brush of his laughter in the air long after he is gone, as though he has left his scent on the page of her existence. Days slip by in a haze. She knows all the comforts awaiting her at home. Husband coaxing laughter at dinner, her little boy's sneakers lining up by the door, but her mind keeps drifting back to the gallery, to the echo of his steps. In her own home, sunlight will pour through lace curtains over the doily where his coffee cup was left cold, and she will tell herself she is grateful for the quiet devotion. Meanwhile, a storm brews in her chest, each moment filled with both guilt and an exhilaration sharper than any blade. Their first meeting is like a collision of two separate worlds. In the gallery's hushed chambers, he stands before a photograph, his gaze distant, as though he sees not a still image but a living breath. She approaches, her reflection in the glass beside the sitter, and they exchange words about the delicate curve of the dancer's bent back, how desire can be frozen in time just as effectively as it can scorch the air. He offers to show her around, all the artists he admires, the hidden crevices where shadows spill into forgotten corners, and she accepts. Their footsteps echo across polished floors beneath vaulted ceilings, and somewhere between the marbled pillars, an unspoken electricity bends the space around them. No one else could have known what transpired in those silences, those stolen glances, but when she steps out into the sunshine and finds herself carrying a single black feather he slipped into her palm to feel its softness, she knows that nothing would ever feel the same again. All the while, the home they've built grows restless around them. He sits at the kitchen table, a morning paper spread before him, but his coffee grows cold as he tries to recall the precise shade of her eyes when she tells him she'll be late. The dog yawns at his feet, and the curtains dance in a breeze he cannot see, the world outside bathed in that same light that once made her glow. He wonders, did she smile for him that morning or for someone else's memory? He pries into every detail, notes the way she brushes her hair differently now, how her lips curve into private lines he cannot trace. He brings flowers home on Saturday afternoons, white lilies that should speak of his love, but she nearly glares when he places them by the window, as though they remind her of some promise she might break. He tries to believe these are coincidences, nothing more, but every corner of their nest grows thick with suspicion, like a candle burned too close to the threads of a silk tapestry. In their intimacy, he becomes a detective, piecing together shards of crumbs she left behind, each one dazzling with the promise of betrayal. One night, when the moon hangs right overhead, she slips out as if carried by a tide. He believes she is asleep, so he finds the letter she left on the pillow, a confession wrung from tears. "I once believed love was enough," it says, "but I have discovered a hunger that demands to be fed." She does not explain why, only that she is sorry. He searches the house for an echo of her slippers but finds none, only the cold remnants of a kiss she stole from the empty air. In her absence he frays, unraveling every memory they wove into the curtain's lace, every photograph she ever smiled beside him, as though a thief has crept through the gallery of their days and stolen the quiet certainties while they slept. He sinks into the couch, watching the pale ceiling as dawn bleeds through the cracks, wondering how a single decision can unravel a lifetime of devotion. Meanwhile, her steps take her deeper into desire's maze. She returns to that outsider, dark hair falling like ink around his shoulders, eyes that seem to know her best secrets, and their affair ignites in that forgotten corner of the gallery, between paintings that speak of pain and passion. She makes promises she never expected to keep. He will never forget the way she trembled when they first touched, a moan swallowed by breath so urgent it left them gasping for simple air. In that silence, she feels alive, her skin awash with the electric glow of forbidden knowledge. At dawn, she dresses and returns to the life of errands and breakfasts, but she carries his shadow in her pocket, a heartbeat in the palm of her hand that hums with a rhythm only she can hear. Every time her husband passes the bathroom to find her hair undone or notes the faint trace of a fragrance not his, she braces herself, knowing the thrill of that secret is worth the quake of her heart. His world spins in another direction. Confusion floods what he thought was a simple marriage. He remembers turning a key in the front door, how a bell jangled but his voice found only echoes. He wanders room to room. Her pillow still holds the curve of her cheek, as though she might materialize if he breathes too softly. He opens the closet to find the other coat that no longer hangs, the scent of another man's cologne sizzling in the sleeve. In his office later, he searches photographs in drawers, looking for the moment where her gaze shifted, where his reflection in her eyes grew distant. Every dollar he earns, every project he scouts, grows to feel hollow, a scaffold built for a life he no longer recognizes. He hunts for answers in the shape of spilled coffee grounds on the counter, in her discarded scarf that trembles with betrayal. When a neighbor mentions seeing her walking alone at dusk, each footstep echoing on the sidewalk, he feels compelled to chase her shadow, longing to hold her close even as he despairs at what he might find. She feels the walls closing in. In the sanctuary of the bookstore, she loses herself among old tomes, seeking solace in characters whose hearts break and heal long before her own has learned to beat again. Each page represents a path not taken, a wanderer who leaves everything behind for a single chance at passion, a couple who cling to each other amid whispers of vice, a woman whose love burns too bright for the life she's built. She slips into that world, slipping further from the man who waits for her at home. When she closes a volume on forbidden desires, her heart stabs with regret, yet she walks back into the night with a hunger she cannot slake. And when she returns to her husband at dawn, he waits with unyielding eyes, a question written in every crease of his face, as though the house itself demands a confession that she cannot yet voice. His suspicion grows until he can no longer live with the question. One afternoon, as she steps out, he follows. Across sunlit streets, through crowds of strangers, he trails her to a small café, where she sits with that outsider, hands wrapped around a cup as if it contains the last remnants of her soul. He watches through a smudged window, seeing her lips curl into a smile not meant for him. In that moment, his heart fractures like a vase dropped on marble. He retreats back into the shadows, yet the knowledge he gains settles into his bones like a poison. He knows he cannot pretend ignorance any longer, though he also fears what the truth demands. that he confront her, that he demand her reasons, that he decide whether the love they shared can rise above this storm or will sink beneath the weight of deceit. She senses he's changed. The corners of his gentle smile now tremble with hurt. The way he reaches for her hand feels both familiar and foreign. One evening, they sit across from each other at dinner, the table spread with Sancerre and roasted chicken, a carefully constructed tableau that once meant home. She watches him lift his fork, pause, then set it down. His eyes search hers, soft, flecked with pain, as though he searches for the woman he once knew in the woman he now fears. "We need to talk," he says, the words rising like smoke from a dying fire. In that hush, her heart sinks, but beneath the panic, a seed of resolve stirs. Perhaps they can rebuild from the shards, perhaps passion can be redirected, perhaps forgiveness might bloom amid the ruins. Or perhaps everything will fall apart beyond repair. They retreat into the living room, the drapes drawn, the walls a soft dove gray that now seems as hollow as their quiet. She speaks first, a trembling whisper about loneliness, about a hunger for recognition that she once thought could be sated by love alone. She tells him about the gallery, the stranger whose voice felt tuned to her heartbeat. She expects anger, but what she sees in his face is a storm of sorrow, an ocean of boyhood dreams drowned by adult betrayal. He listens, his jaw clenched, breathing in rhythms that echo the way she once carried their child in her womb, with fierce protectiveness and an aching longing for what was never enough. When she finishes, the silence stretches until their regrets threaten to drown them both. Finally, he asks the question, "Was any of it real?" She wants to answer that love was still real, that their years held truth beyond her mistakes, but her voice catches in her throat, and she can only nod. In the days that follow, the house grows haunted by absence. No tears fall, just the echoes of unanswered questions trailing through empty rooms, her husband's footsteps even when he stays silent, her son's laughter swallowed by the hush, the dog's head cocked to one side, searching for a scent no longer there. She sleeps with one eye open, expecting the phantom touch of a hand that once traced her spine. He sleeps in the guest room, dreams flickering between regret and fury, never fully finding the peace he craves. Each of them carries the other's ghost. They wander through the home they built, as if strangers searching for threads of a life that dissolved the moment she first crossed that line. Then comes the moment of collision, a late afternoon phone call that shatters the fragile piece they've cobbled together. He answers. Her voice comes across the line trembling with dread. "I saw him in the hospital." She speaks of an accident. The man who once wove passion into her nights now lies in a bed, hooked to machines, flesh torn by a truck's wheels. His world narrows until she finds herself standing outside the hospital door, the waiting room lights buzzing like neon insects. She cannot breathe until he hands her a note, folded small as a promise she once swore. It is from that outsider. "I'm sorry. I never meant for this." In that moment, she confronts the shattering truth. Her affair exacts a price no remorse can undo. She realizes that this man's life now hangs in the balance because she wandered beyond the boundaries she once called freedom. When her husband arrives, quiet, jaw set, she sees the weight of her choices in his eyes. He does not speak of judgment, only of fear. Fear that the line between life and death is as thin as a whisper, fear that trust once severed may never find its seams, fear that the man he loved could slip away, leaving only hollow echoes in his place. In that hush, she kneels beside the bed, holding that stranger's hand as if it were a fading star, and prays for his breath to catch again. She hopes for a miracle even as she knows there is no redemption sentence short of sacrifice. Outside, her husband waits in the cold lobby, his own heart tangled in questions he cannot voice. What does it mean to lose a woman to another life, then find her beside a stranger in a hospital bed? If love could break her, could it also forgive her? The hours stretch thin until dawn's pale fingers pry open the sky. News arrives. The man has survived, yet with a gash so deep that his shoulder hangs like a ragged wound. The surgeon reveals the truth. He will never move his arm the same way, never feel the caress that once ignited his heart. In that moment, she feels a fury so vast it nearly devours her. Fury at fate, fury at her own hands for weaving a web that caught an innocent soul in its tangle, fury at the world for balancing mercy and cruelty on a blade's edge. And when her husband removes his coat and sits beside her on the linoleum floor, eyes hollow as a storm-tossed night, she understands that this shared grief may be the only thing capable of forging them anew. His world spins in another direction. Confusion floods what he thought was a simple marriage. He remembers turning a key in the front door, how a bell jangled but his voice found only echoes. He wanders room to room. Her pillow still holds the curve of her cheek, as though she might materialize if he breathes too softly. He opens the closet to find the other coat that no longer hangs, the scent of another man's cologne sizzling in the sleeve. In his office later, he searches photographs in drawers, looking for the moment where her gaze shifted, where his reflection in her eyes grew distant. Every dollar he earns, every project he scouts, grows to feel hollow, a scaffold built for a life he no longer recognizes. He hunts for answers in the shape of spilled coffee grounds on the counter, in her discarded scarf that trembles with betrayal. When a neighbor mentions seeing her walking alone at dusk, each footstep echoing on the sidewalk, he feels compelled to chase her shadow, longing to hold her close even as he despairs at what he might find. She feels the walls closing in. In the sanctuary of the bookstore, she loses herself among old tomes, seeking solace in characters whose hearts break and heal long before her own has learned to beat again. Each page represents a path not taken, a wanderer who leaves everything behind for a single chance at passion, a couple who cling to each other amid whispers of vice, a woman whose love burns too bright for the life she's built. She slips into that world, slipping further from the man who waits for her at home. When she closes a volume on forbidden desires, her heart stabs with regret, yet she walks back into the night with a hunger she cannot slake. And when she returns to her husband at dawn, he waits with unyielding eyes, a question written in every crease of his face, as though the house itself demands a confession that she cannot yet voice. His suspicion grows until he can no longer live with the question. One afternoon, as she steps out, he follows. Across sunlit streets, through crowds of strangers, he trails her to a small cafe, where she sits with that outsider, hands wrapped around a cup as if it contains the last remnants of her soul. He watches through a smudged window, seeing her lips curl into a smile not meant for him. In that moment, his heart fractures like a vase dropped on marble. He retreats back into the shadows, yet the knowledge he gains settles into his bones like a poison. He knows he cannot pretend ignorance any longer, though he also fears what the truth demands, that he confront her, that he demand her reasons, that he decide whether the love they shared can rise above this storm or will sink beneath the weight of deceit. She senses he's changed. The corners of his gentle smile now tremble with hurt. The way he reaches for her hand feels both familiar and foreign. One evening, they sit across from each other at dinner, the table spread with Sancerre and roasted chicken, a carefully constructed tableau that once meant home. She watches him lift his fork, pause, then set it down. His eyes search hers, soft, flecked with pain, as though he searches for the woman he once knew in the woman he now fears. "We need to talk," he says, the words rising like smoke from a dying fire. In that hush, her heart sinks, but beneath the panic, a seed of resolve stirs. Perhaps they can rebuild from the shards, perhaps passion can be redirected, perhaps forgiveness might bloom amid the ruins. Or perhaps everything will fall apart beyond repair. They retreat into the living room, the drapes drawn, the walls a soft dove gray that now seems as hollow as their quiet. She speaks first, a trembling whisper about loneliness, about a hunger for recognition that she once thought could be sated by love alone. She tells him about the gallery, the stranger whose voice felt tuned to her heartbeat. She expects anger, but what she sees in his face is a storm of sorrow, an ocean of boyhood dreams drowned by adult betrayal. He listens, his jaw clenched, breathing in rhythms that echo the way she once carried their child in her womb, with fierce protectiveness and an aching longing for what was never enough. When she finishes, the silence stretches until their regrets threaten to drown them both. Finally, he asks the question, was any of it real? She wants to answer that love was still real, that their years held truth beyond her mistakes, but her voice catches in her throat, and she can only nod. In the days that follow, the house grows haunted by absence. No tears fall, just the echoes of unanswered questions trailing through empty rooms, her husband's footsteps even when he stays silent, her son's laughter swallowed by the hush, the dog's head cocked to one side, searching for a scent no longer there. She sleeps with one eye open, expecting the phantom touch of a hand that once traced her spine. He sleeps in the guest room, dreams flickering between regret and fury, never fully finding the peace he craves. Each of them carries the other's ghost. They wander through the home they built, as if strangers searching for threads of a life that dissolved the moment she first crossed that line. Then comes the moment of collision, a late afternoon phone call that shatters the fragile piece they've cobbled together. He answers. Her voice comes across the line trembling with dread. "I saw him in the hospital." She speaks of an accident. The man who once wove passion into her nights now lies in a bed, hooked to machines, flesh torn by a truck's wheels. His world narrows until she finds herself standing outside the hospital door, the waiting room lights buzzing like neon insects. She cannot breathe until he hands her a note, folded small as a promise she once swore. It is from that outsider. "I'm sorry. I never meant for this." In that moment, she confronts the shattering truth. Her affair exacts a price no remorse can undo. She realizes that this man's life now hangs in the balance because she wandered beyond the boundaries she once called freedom. When her husband arrives, quiet, jaw set, she sees the weight of her choices in his eyes. He does not speak of judgment, only of fear. Fear that the line between life and death is as thin as a whisper, fear that trust once severed may never find its seams, fear that the man he loved could slip away, leaving only hollow echoes in his place. In that hush, she kneels beside the bed, holding that stranger's hand as if it were a fading star, and prays for his breath to catch again. She hopes for a miracle even as she knows there is no redemption sentence short of sacrifice. Outside, her husband waits in the cold lobby, his own heart tangled in questions he cannot voice. What does it mean to lose a woman to another life, then find her beside a stranger in a hospital bed? If love could break her, could it also forgive her? The hours stretch thin until dawn's pale fingers pry open the sky. News arrives. The man has survived, yet with a gash so deep that his shoulder hangs like a ragged wound. Their marriage, now 6 years woven into the fabric of suburban routine, felt as comforting as a well-fitted coat. Edward worked in a real estate office downtown, his days measured by contract signings and client luncheons. He returned each evening around 6, briefcase in hand, to a home scented with vanilla candles and the promise of a husband who would pause in the doorway to admire the way the late afternoon light shimmered across her shoulders. Their son, Patrick, now in his early teens, was already gone to school, the echo of his bedroom door closing a gentle punctuation to the start of her day. Connie prepared toast and eggs with a practiced hand, plating them carefully on the kitchen island, as though each meal were a small testament to devotion. She poured her coffee into a mug etched with his initials and caught her reflection in the window, her soft brown hair caught in a clip at her nape, her light blue blouse smooth and unblemished. She sighed, as she did each morning, grateful for the unspoken warmth that filled their home, but underneath, something restive stirred, as though a single bee had slipped into their hive to rattle the comb. That morning, as she drove south to the bookstore where she worked part-time, the familiar hum of the engine seemed too soft, as though it had begun to lull her into complacency. The world outside streamed by, neat rows of maple trees bleeding orange and crimson into the neighborhood lawns, the occasional jogger bundled against an October chill, and the flashing sign of the coffee stand where Edward often met a client. She knew every bump in the road, every curve of asphalt, yet they felt charged with a new electricity, as though the streets themselves carried whispers of something she could not yet name. At the bookstore, she locked her car doors with more deliberation than usual, her heart fluttering with a tenderness that quickly tangled in a knot of apprehension. No one would suspect, no one would guess, and yet she sensed eyes glancing, as though the very walls harbored secrets waiting to be unearthed. Inside, the morning light glowed through tall windows, illuminating polished oak shelves stacked with paperbacks and hardcovers, each spine lined like a soldier standing at rigid attention. She greeted customers with a warm, practiced smile, tilting her head to catch new arrivals' names on their loyalty cards. But her attention fractured whenever a stranger passed, as though she sensed the fragility of her own composure. She felt as though she teetered on a narrow ledge, the world yawning beneath her, and a single misstep might send her plummeting into a void she could neither name nor escape. She shelved a row of poetry collections, books that whispered of heartbreak and redemption, and wondered whether her own life had begun to mirror a verse she had once admired, lines that spoke of desire like a hunger impossible to sate. The bell above the door jingled, and she glimpsed him before she heard his voice. Dark hair just long enough to brush his jacket collar, eyes alive with a confidence that flickered at the edges of his smile. He moved with a casual grace, as though the bookstore itself were merely another stage where he could command attention without a single word. She watched him drift between tables of travel guides and modern literature, pausing to finger the cover of a new art book. His presence made the midday air shimmer, an iridescent flutter that disturbed every carefully calibrated moment she had known. When he spoke, his voice slid around her like a melody she had never anticipated. "Excuse me, do you know if this edition has any illustrations?" He held the art book out with one hand, and she found herself unscrewing her carefully constructed calm. She felt her cheeks flush beneath the overhead lights as she offered him a tentative nod, certain that he saw far more than her words. Their conversation began with the art book, delicate black and white drawings of dancers frozen mid-pirouette, muscles taut beneath coil and sinew, and the stranger's appreciation of chiaroscuro. He spoke of how a single shadow could capture the essence of longing, how each line of graphite held the potential to transcend flesh. She nodded, sharing her own impressions, and felt an unexpected ache when his gaze slid from the page to her face, as though he saw her not only in 3 dimensions but in the very heart of her uncertainty. He introduced himself as Paul, an artist covering the city's galleries for a cultural journal, and she found his voice a warm hum that vibrated beneath her skin. She offered him a recommendation for another volume, one with color plates, reproductions so vivid they felt as though they might step free from the page. He accepted her suggestion with a small laugh that made her pulse race, and she sensed the world shift on its axis. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours, as they spoke of exhibitions she had never visited and sculptures he had admired in distant museums. His words carried the weight of a shared secret. Each syllable was a brushstroke painting possibility on canvases she thought were long sealed. When she glanced at the clock, ticking with merciless certainty, she realized her lunch break was almost gone. The bell above the door jingled again, and she felt a pang of regret at the thought of losing his company. He smiled gently, as though reading her mind, and said, "I'll be at the new gallery downtown this evening if you'd care to join me." Her breath caught in his invitation, as though a door had opened to a world she had never known could exist, and she nodded before her mind had time to rebel, saying, "I'd like that." She arrived at home that evening to the familiar ache beneath her ribs, as though her heart had begun beating out of sync. Edward found her in the living room, arranging fresh flowers in a vase, the lilies' white petals glowing in the soft lamplight. He smiled and leaned for a quick kiss, the kind that said hello and welcome home. She returned it gently, attempting to anchor herself in the warmth of their life together. They exchanged pleasantries. Work had been busy, their son had a soccer game, but her mind flickered to his request. "I'm meeting a friend downtown for a late showing," she told Edward, lips trembling as she shaped her words into something true enough to pass. He raised an eyebrow, his own instincts flaring with a trace of unease, but he touched her arm and said, "I hope it's nothing serious." His tone carried both teasing warmth and a flicker of worry, as though he sensed her world had tipped beneath her feet. She smiled, smoothing a strand of hair behind her ear and lifting her chin with a promise, "Just a friend, dear. You know I'd never lead you into danger." The evening light softened as she moved through rush-hour traffic, every red light stretching her nerves taut, every passing car a potential witness to her secret. She slid into a parking spot near a small modern gallery, its windows aglow with spotlights trained on abstract paintings that seemed more alive than still. She felt his presence before she saw him, an electric charge in the air, a warmth that pulsed like a heartbeat. When he emerged from behind a steel-framed sculpture, dressed in jeans and a leather jacket, she felt the world contract around him, as though each moment without his gaze had felt like a breath held too long. She offered a hesitant smile, but he stepped into her space and brushed a wisp of hair from her face, a motion so intimate it sent shockwaves through her. In his eyes she saw a hunger she had never known she could possess, a raw desire tempered by gentle awe. Inside, they moved between canvases, lamps illuminating brushstrokes in hues that ranged from fiery crimson to midnight blue. He spoke of the painter as though tracing a line to his own soul, and she listened, feeling every word resonate in the hollow of her chest where longing had begun to take root. She wished Edward could see how he made her feel. No, she wished she could feel that fearless again, like an entire sky had opened to swallow her regrets. When the gallery emptied, save for a single guard dozing in the corner, he guided her to a back room hung with photographs of dancers caught mid-leap. He pointed to a single print, a woman suspended between earth and sky, her arms splayed like bird wings. "That's meant to capture the moment when you don't know whether you'll fly or fall," he said, voice low, his breath tickling her earlobe. She swallowed, her pulse hammering in her throat as the word began to unspool, desire. In that hush, she felt the pull of something forbidden, a current too strong to resist. Hours slipped away as they talked, the gallery's wooden floor creaking beneath them like a confidant in the night. At some point, he reached for her hand, and their fingers interlaced like two vines seeking sunlight. She felt his skin, warm beneath hers, and each pulse of his blood echoed within her own veins. Then, as though the world outside could no longer contain them, he kissed her, softly at first, a question pressed against her lips. She answered with a tremor that shook her from head to heel, surrendering to an ache that felt both terrible and radiant. Their kiss deepened, urgent and unspoken, until the gallery walls seemed to dissolve around them, leaving only each other in a sacred space where truth reigned supreme. In that moment, she knew their lives had tilted toward an abyss from which there might be no return, and yet fear dissolved in the heat of their embrace. When she returned home late, her heels clicking down the hallway like whispered apologies, Edward stirred on the couch, sleep heavy in his eyes. He reached for her, expecting the familiar contours of her body, but found only a hollow ache. She slipped into the bedroom, her heart pounding like a funeral drum, and closed the door with a soft click that felt like a verdict rendered. In the hush of their room, she folded into the bed without touching him, wrapping herself in her own tension like a shroud. Edward lay down beside her, his breath an even rhythm she used to find comforting, but tonight it echoed with accusation. She closed her eyes, pressing palms to her temples, feeling the quake of her own betrayal ripple through every nerve. In her mind, she watched the mirror of their lives shatter into jagged pieces, the birthdays unremembered, the laughter stolen by secrets, the trust fracturing beneath the weight of one impulsive decision. Morning found her drifting through a daze, as though she had awakened from a fever dream into a world she no longer recognized. She watched Edward pour coffee, the steam curling like phantom hands between them, and felt guilt settle in her chest like a stone. She wanted to confess every detail, to lay bare the truth and cleanse her soul in the torrent of his anger or disappointment. Yet she realized she could not. Her fear of destroying everything they had built was too fierce, too absolute. She forced a smile, accepting his gift of steaming cup, and spoke of errands she must run. He nodded, suspicion flickering behind his eyes but unvoiced. She slipped outside, wrapping a scarf around her throat, and walked to her car with the weight of regret pressing down, every step a reminder that once choice had darkened her world, the light they once took for granted could never shine the same way again. Later that day, at the bookstore, she moved among the shelves like a ghost, her mind haunted by the memory of his hand in hers. She fetched a stack of new releases, arranging them on display tables, but her fingers tensed each time they brushed a paperback just as lightly as his fingertips had brushed her skin. Colleagues drifted by, asking whether she was all right, and she offered a nod that felt hollow as an empty shell. A regular customer asked about the latest biography, and she answered with a tone too soft, as though her voice were fraying inside. Each mundane task, ringing up a sale, dusting off shelves, restocking the bestseller table, felt absurd in light of the river of consequence that now surged beneath her skin. Every crease of her apron held the imprint of the moment she had stepped beyond the boundaries of love into something uncharted, and she felt its weight in every breath she drew. As afternoon stretched into evening, she closed the bookstore doors with hands still trembling. Outside, the sky was the same pale blue she had once admired on perfect autumn afternoons, yet the world felt narrowed, as though a lens had tightened around her chest, squeezing until her breath came in ragged bursts. She drove toward the gallery where she had lived the most profound moment of her life, yearning to trace each step back, to unmake the choices she had made. But when she reached the street, she found only the shuttered facade, the windows dark at this hour, as though the gallery itself had vanished into thin air. She leaned on the steering wheel, head in her hands, and let tears slip unbidden, mourning the loss of innocence she had never known she cherished until it was gone in the hush of her apartment that night. Edward's presence felt both distant and suffocating. He sat on the edge of the bed, the lamplight tracing dark crescents beneath his eyes, as though he had spent days awake searching for answers despite the pointless weight of hope. She approached slowly, her steps tentative, as though her own feet feared betrayal. He reached for her, and she drew back, hungry to tell him everything even as she trembled at the thought of his reaction. He stood, removing his jacket and draping it across a chair, and faced her. His voice was soft but steady, demanding not anger but honest admission. "I saw you at the gallery," he said. The words fell like stones upon her heart, each one ringing with a truth she had prayed to avoid. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the tempest she had summoned, wondering whether love could survive the storm's full fury or whether they would be swept apart by the very passion she had once believed would set her free. In that still moment, she realized that their world had shifted irrevocably. The home she had once found so comforting now felt like a trap, the corners charged with the memory of her mistake. Yet she also knew that no matter how far she had wandered, home still waited, fragile, wounded, but perhaps not beyond repair. She drew in a breath as though summoning the courage to speak a vow she had nearly forgotten. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears trailing down her cheeks. And in that admission lay a promise, fragile but alive, that they might find a path forward, even if it meant traversing the darkest valleys of their own hearts. He drove away from the hospital in a daze, the early morning light etched with pale determination as though it, too, were watching him. Behind his eyes lingered the memory of her voice, hushed, tremulous, as she had scraped out the story of that night, a figure darting across the rain-slicked asphalt, a scream swallowed by the screech of tires. He drove away from the hospital in a daze, the early morning light etched with pale determination as though it, too, were watching him. Behind his eyes lingered the memory of her voice, hushed, tremulous, as she had scraped out the story of that night, a figure darting across the rain-slicked asphalt, a scream swallowed by the screech of tires, and then nothing but shattered glass and a body crumpled beneath the lamp-post's jaundiced glow. Each word she spoke landed like a blade on his conscience, and as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles blanched with the weight of what he intended to do. The streets stretched before him in a ribbon of shame. Every passerby seemed a ghost whose silent witness mocked him, reminding him that once a man crosses the line between fidelity and revenge, there is no returning to the light of day unscathed. He found himself on the edge of the industrial district, warehouses with broken windows, street lamps flickering like dying stars, and he parked beneath an alley's yawning shadow. Rain had transformed the pavement into silvered glass, mirroring the flicker of neon signs from a distant bar. He waited as though time itself had spun into a hush, counting breaths that felt too loud in his ears. The man who had become the axis of their unraveling emerged from the darkness, coat collar turned up against the chill, shoulders hunched against the drizzle. He walked with the casual grace of the untouched, oblivious to the ruin he had sown in two lives, the one tethered to a wife's guilt and the other knotted in a husband's despair. When he passed by the sedan, head bent as though lost in his own daydream, Edward pressed the door-handle with the quiet resolve of a man saying farewell to the life he once knew. A second later, his foot drove the accelerator without thought, and the air erupted in the roar of collision. The hood crumpled with a brittle confession, metal folding like paper beneath the impact. The man's body jerked with the force, limbs betraying the shock that had split his head, as though he had awakened mid-dream and tumbled to a cold reality. Edward shut his eyes as though in prayer, and the world narrowed to the heartbeat thrumming in his temples. When he opened them again, the man lay sprawled on the pavement, arms splayed wide as though supplicating to the indifferent heavens. A pool of dark crimson shaped itself beneath the man's chest, and Edward's breath coated the glass with a single ragged fog. He pressed his foot harder as though pressing a final verdict, until the body no longer moved. In that moment, neither thunder nor raindrop could drown out the finality of his act. Vengeance had found its voice, and now the road stretched behind him fractured beyond repair. He drove off as though fleeing a storm, the rain washing over the windshield in streaks that made the world blurry, as though trying to erase his deeds. In the back seat lay the echo of her confession, her tears pouring like rain through his memory, and the sudden weight of gratitude pressed him into silence. He no longer felt the moral high ground beneath his feet. It had collapsed in on him, leaving him sunk in a pit of desperation and devotion. When he turned onto the avenue leading to the precinct, red and blue lights danced across his rear-view mirror in a balletic accusation. His heart clattered like a trapped bird, and yet a perverse calm settled over him. He had decided to shield her, to take the full measure of guilt upon himself. They would ask him questions he could never answer without condemning the very woman whose lips he had once kissed with trust. So he rolled down the window, scented with the stink of wet asphalt, and let the handcuffs click shut around his wrists, a metallic punctuation to a silence that would now stretch across months, perhaps years. Behind the gray drape of a partition, she folded her hands on her lap, fingers tracing each strand of tension in her corded nerves. She wore the same blouse he had kissed goodbye that morning, its fabric now stiff with salt and remorse. In the lobby, uniformed officers bustled about like distant planets orbiting a black hole. His act of violence swallowed them all into a gravity she could not escape. She watched them sign papers, stamp forms, recite misdemeanor counts, none of which whispered the darkest truth she carried in her chest. When a detective escorted her into the witness room, its walls a warped desaturation of drab beige, the detective's eyes flicked from her face to the mirror behind her, as though expecting her confession to spill through the glass. She swallowed, feeling the sting of her own shame burn her throat, but the words stayed locked behind clenched teeth. A single question hung in the air. "Do you recognize the victim?" She shook her head. The detective frowned at the vague answer, but she refused to betray him. At home, the house hummed with uncertainty. Their son, sleeping on the couch, stirred as though he sensed the world had tilted. He found her leaning against the kitchen counter, the teacup in her hand untouched, its rim cool against her lips. She looked at him, tears still gathering in the corners of her eyes, and in that moment she saw his own confusion mirrored in her face, a child's innocent love shackling her to a secret that could extinguish them both. He asked gentle questions. "Where's Daddy? When will he be back?" And she bit her lip to keep from replying, "Because he's gone forever." She swallowed and kissed him on the forehead, her voice a cracked whisper. "He'll be home soon, sweetie. Everything will be all right." She pulled him close, inhaling the scent of his hair, as though anchoring him to a world she had nearly torn apart. The dog sniffed at her leg, sensing the tension that pulsed through her like a muted drum, and she reached down to cradle its head in her hands, seeking any comfort her children and pets could offer as a bridge to her own broken heart. Outside, Edward sat in a stock cell, the harsh fluorescent light chipping at his resolve until his face was a map of shadows and regret. He folded his head onto the steel tabletop, wrists chafing where handcuffs bit into flesh, and he imagined her standing before him, pale, defiant, terrified. He could almost feel the frayed edge of her mind pressing against the prison's bars, as though her guilt wove itself into the fabric of his punishment. A guard's footsteps echoed down the corridor, and Edward lifted his head, each step slicing through him like a serrated blade. He braced himself when they slid a thin slab of bread across the table, his dinner and his penance. He tore at it without unaesthetic care, the stale crumbs reminding him of the emptiness that would fill his days and nights until he could make sense of his choices. In her own sanctum, a bedroom now haunted by cold sheets and unspoken fears, she paced the hardwood floors as dusk bled across the sky. The thermostat clicked behind her, the lone mechanical solace in a house grown too silent. She lit a single candle and watched the flame quiver, dancing in rhythms that she could not predict, like the rest of her life. A whispered memory of his gentle hands, of his soft voice begging for honesty, played through her mind in an endless loop. She combed through moments, a laugh they shared over burnt pancakes, the comfort of his open arms, the grace in his forgiveness, searching for a path that might lead them back. But every flicker of that candle seemed to mock her, as though daring her to reach out and heal a wound too deep for any mortal touch. News of the accident had spread, a thin ribbon of rumor that wound its way through the neighborhood. Neighbors who once waved pleasant good mornings now offered clipped expressions, their gazes darting away as though they had glimpsed a stain on her reputation. The barista at the corner cafe greeted her with a cautious nod, no longer spilling compliments on her usual chai latte. She felt their eyes on her as she walked, as though every face etched with the morning's routine hid an opinion she couldn't read. She became a whisper beneath the hum of everyday chatter, as though her pleasure-seeking now branded her a traitor to something sacred. Each step away from those looking, each forced smile passed off as gracious, only fanned the embers of her despair. She longed for the grace of obscurity, a world where she might hide from the memory of how she had shattered 2 lives in one terrible instant. Meanwhile, Edward sat through interrogations that felt like centuries compressed into brief daylight hours. He answered the detective's questions in flat monotones, carefully revealing enough to appear contrite but not enough to implicate her. He crafted each sentence like a trapdoor, dropping fragments of lies into the spaces between the truth. A forensic officer slid a coffee stain beneath him, asking where his car had been washed last. He replied smoothly, "The local car wash, the one with the falling bubble logo." He did not mention the late hour at which he had driven that stolen sedan into the rain, crunching the stranger's skull beneath his tire. Each question felt like another layer of his soul being stripped away, his identity dissolving into the role of scapegoat for a crime he had willingly committed in her name. In that hush, he realized with a numbing clarity that the man who had once found love in her eyes had now become a stranger to the self that lived beneath his flesh, a stranger as frightening as the rain-slicked roads on the night everything shattered. Their son's world narrowed to whispered questions in the dark. "Why is Daddy not here? Where's Daddy's smile?" Connie answered each one with the aching solace a mother uses to cradle her own grief. When he found her collapsed in the hallway, her knees bruised where she had fallen in silent weeping, he hugged her like she was the one needing protection instead of him. He carried her to the couch, his small arms looping around her neck, and whispered, "It's okay, Mommy. Daddy loves you." The simplicity of his words cleaved through her despair like a blade of sunlight through storm clouds. In that moment, the truth she had kept buried in her chest remained enough. She knew that to rescue him from the wreckage of her guilt might be the only way she could save the last fragment of her humanity. In the corridor outside the interrogation room, Edward's phone vibrated against the metal tabletop. It was her calling, each ring a nail driven into his heart. He hesitated, palm hovering over the receiver, as though one touch might condemn him further. Finally, he answered, her voice cracked with urgency. "Please come home," she pleaded. "I don't know how to keep going without you." He closed his eyes, picturing her face, the soft shadows beneath her eyes, the stain of salt on her cheeks. In that moment, he willed himself to believe that love could still be their guide, even though its compass had long since shattered. "I'm coming," he whispered, the crack in his voice sealing his fate. When she saw him appear in the doorway, his shoulders stooped beneath a weight no one else could see, her hands trembled like a bird's wings in a closed cage. She rose to meet him, tears streaming as though the floodgates of every unspoken word had broken free in a single instant. He took her hand, the one that had hidden a betrayal far worse than his own grievances, and she felt the friction of his skin on hers like a spark she had nearly forgotten. She leaned into him, shoulder sinking against his chest, and he closed his arms around her as though she were the only anchor left in a world lost to chaos. They stood like that for an eternity the night could never measure, each breath an apology, each heartbeat a promise that, somehow, they might squeeze a future from the shattered fragments they had become. They emerged in the pale morning light of their driveway, neighbors peering down the street with curiosity as though expecting a scene from some melodrama. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, guiding her into the embrace of home, but she stiffened beneath his touch. She turned, and with one tremulous motion, placed her palms on his chest, feeling the rhythm of his heartbeat still aligned, still hers, despite the chasm he had built around himself. She lifted her head, her wet lashes catching dawn's tender glow, and she whispered, "I love you." Her voice, at once a plea and a vow, hung between them like a fragile truce. He searched her eyes, saw a vulnerability he had never known, a sorrow so raw it pierced through every lie, every stolen moment. In that unguarded gaze, he recognized the woman he had vowed to protect, the same woman who had so nearly destroyed them both with her yearning. They sank to the front steps, shoulders brushing as they traced the outlines of their past in the cracked concrete. No words emerged at first, only the sound of leaves rustling in the weak autumn breeze. He let his head rest against hers, and together they felt the tremors of the world beyond, the hum of distant traffic, the rustle of branches against the house's siding. In that hush, they found a place that belonged neither to guilt nor to grief, but to the slender hope that love, when tempered by tragedy, might yet endure. She tilted her head, brushing a strand of hair from his face, and he closed his eyes, relishing the touch as though it were the first vestige of redemption. A police cruiser rolled by on the avenue, its lights muted in the dawn. Inside the patrol car sat a detective, reading Edward's statement one last time, riffling through the ghosts of his lies and the promises he would now have to keep. The engine idled as though it, too, were uncertain whether to move forward or linger in that moment of brittle promise. In the driver's seat, the detective scribbled a note on a pad: "Victim's cause of death, vehicular trauma. Husband's confession voluntary, no evidence of intentional homicide." And in that single admission lay the twisted irony of justice, that one man would take a life to save a marriage, and the law would smile as though it understood. Their son emerged from the open front door, clutching a baseball glove and wearing the innocent grin of a boy who believed everything could be made right by a game of catch. He ran to them, his small feet skidding across pebbles, and held out the glove as though extending a peace offering. Edward knelt, the ache in his bones echoing with the promise of imperfection. He took the glove and tossed the ball, imperfect, jagged, across to his son, who caught it without hesitation, laughing as though the air itself were spun from cotton candy. Connie watched them, tears slipping down her face, but they tasted less of sorrow now and more of something salted by relief. She realized that while their world lay fractured, the simple exchange of ball and glove offered them a chance to reclaim something that felt like home. They played until the sun climbed higher, the morning warbling with birdsong and the distant hum of life continuing on. She saw in Edward's shoulders the slack of a burden lifted. They played until the sun climbed higher, the morning warbling with birdsong and the distant hum of life continuing on. She saw in Edward's shoulders the slack of a burden lifted, though she knew new burdens would come, questions he might ask that she could not face, memories that might haunt them in future twilight hours. But for these moments she allowed herself to believe that the wound between them could find a way to mend, that love, stubborn and resilient as a single blade of grass pushing through a fractured sidewalk, could bloom again. They paused when the ball sailed into a patch of weeds, and their son ran off to retrieve it, hopping over a flower bed where roses bloomed though autumn's chill had begun to gnaw at their petals. She wanted him to understand that sometimes the most beautiful things thrive in spite of the cold. Edward reached for her hand, and she felt that his grip carried the tremor of a man who had danced too close to the abyss and now breathed with fresh wonder at the sky. Together, they bent to gather daisies from the garden, daisies that had somehow survived frost and neglect, and pressed them between the pages of a book they kept on the coffee table, a well-worn keepsake filled with photos of sunlit picnics and lazy Sundays. When their son returned with the ball, he called out an invitation, "Catch!" And Edward looked at her, tilting his head as though asking, "Shall we?" She exhaled, allowing herself a smile not marred by regret, and nodded. They rose, joined hands, and followed their son into the yard, a family imperfect, stained by choices that reverberated like thunder, yet striving to breathe in a new dawn. In the theater of their lives, the second act had bled into tragedy and back again into fragile hope. The mansion of what once was had collapsed, but from its rubble they began to build a different structure, one defined not by certainty but by mutual vow, to meet each other's flaws with mercy, to forge a bond strong enough to endure the echoes of broken promises. The night storm had passed, leaving their world damp and raw, but the sunrise illuminated a truth they could no longer deny, that love, when tempered by fire, might shatter before it could be reforged, yet still find a way to shine. And so they walked toward that dawn together, uncertain, haunted, but no longer alone, in pursuit of a redemption that began with a single, trembling confession and the hope that, in the end, it could be enough. Connie's mornings began like a ritual. The son's pale fingers brushing through linen curtains, a soft humming of coffee brewing in the kitchen, and a faint echo of her husband's footsteps on the stairs. In those early hours, when the world felt paused between heartbeats, she was the embodiment of grace meeting quiet desperation. Her hair, a cascade of soft brown waves, framed a face that held both warmth and a shadow of something restless, like a compass needle quivering just before the first flicker of dawn. At breakfast she moved with the ease of a woman who had mastered small acts of love, pouring orange juice into Patrick's cereal bowl, plating eggs with an artist's eye, brushing a floral napkin across the table so it lay perfectly. Yet beneath the practiced veneer was a pulse of yearning she barely recognized, a tremor at the edges of her heart that whispered of a life more vivid than the one she inhabited. She bore this longing like a secret note folded into her pocket, private, jagged, and pulsing with possibility she dared not name. Her marriage to Edward had begun as the kind of love story people described in hushed, reverent tones. He was her childhood friend, the boy who teased her with soft laughter and the promise of tomorrow. When they married, their days seemed as seamless as the cradle-to-the-sky life they built. Summer backyard barbecues for friends, Sunday afternoons with Patrick in the park, and shared whispers that felt as precious as the hush of snowfall. But somewhere along the way, the everyday gentleness turned into something else, a comfortable rhythm that felt more like a song stuck on repeat than a dance still set alight by passion. Connie cared deeply for Edward and adored their son, yet she found herself reaching for a spark she couldn't conjure from the routine of thermoses packed neatly with sandwiches and the soft hum of vacuum cleaners underfoot. That spark, she realized one late afternoon as she watched Edward reviewing contracts in his home office, was something she might have lost, something that had once made her heart gallop but now left it hiccuping in quiet wonder. Paul entered her life like an unseasonable breeze, sweeping in when she least expected it. She first saw him in the art gallery, silhouetted against a piece depicting a dancer caught mid-leap, an image of both vulnerability and power that seemed to mirror her own unspoken contradictions. He stood there, his dark hair forming a halo around a face that bore traces of both mischief and sorrow. Connie felt as though her own shadow had unfurled and slipped into his form, and when he turned to speak to her, his voice slid between them like a fine silk thread. He spoke of chiaroscuro, of how light and darkness collided on canvas to create something that felt alive, and she found herself nodding as though every word were a balm to the restlessness inside her. There was a magnetism to him that felt almost dangerous, like a moth drawn to a flame that could sear its wings. His questions were gentle, his attentiveness almost unnerving, as though he saw not a bookstore clerk but a woman whose very soul throbbed with unacknowledged ache. In his presence, her breaths came shorter, her senses sharpened, and the world seemed to fray at the edges, revealing a tapestry of hidden possibility. He spoke easily of his life, an artist who wrote for galleries, a free spirit who roamed between cities, living in the stark beauty of counterculture apartments with walls hung in canvases that looked alive. Paul's words poured forth in lilting patterns, as though every sentence were a brushstroke painting an alternate reality. He confessed a fascination with the notion of surrender to beauty, to art, to the riot of color that spilled from a painter's palette. He described evenings spent in smoky loft studios, where the company of other wanderers became a chorus of urgent voices seeking meaning against brick walls covered in graffiti. To Connie, his world illuminated corners of her own that had always felt shadowed, corners where warmth should have been but was instead a hollow ache. When he asked about her, he leaned forward as though she were the poem he'd been reciting to himself, and the calm authority in his gaze made her realize how badly she had wanted to be seen. In that gallery, under the hush of spotlights and the gentle pulse of an unfinished symphony, she felt her boundaries dissolve, each one a delicate membrane separating the life she knew from the life she desired. As her world quietly shifted, Edward remained a steadfast presence, a man whose strength wore the form of gentle support. He approached fatherhood as though it were a sacred calling, his hands expert at tying shoelaces, building Lego castles, and soothing Patrick when nightmares crept into his dreams. In the evenings he would sweep her into his arms, his touch as familiar as a favorite book. He whispered his love with the humility of a man who believed the most profound magic was etched in the safety of shared walls and unspoken vows. His devotion radiated from him, the way he'd linger over breakfast, asking about her day, or smooth a strand of hair behind her ear in the quiet twilight. He possessed a quiet intelligence, speaking of ambitions and mortgages without a hint of braggadocio, just a steady heartbeat of responsibility that grounded their lives in something real. Yet Connie began to see something flicker in his eyes, an ember of suspicion she could not fully comprehend. He noticed the way her gaze lingered a moment too long on her phone when he was out of earshot, the faint tinge of perfume she wore that he could not place among the florals he knew in her drawer. One evening, as she returned from Paul's clandestine invitation, she found Edward pacing the living room. The blue light of the television flickered across his face, throwing hard lines along his jaw. He asked where she had been, concern shading his voice, and she offered a stumbling explanation. He pressed on, asked whether she was maintaining her part-time job simply for the bookstore's sake or whether something had filled the space between them. In his eyes, she saw the ghost of a man grappling with the notion that the life they'd built together might not be enough. He bore his worry like a silent whistle, a signal that neither of them could ignore. Patrick, their son, was a truant observer of these currents, his world compact, defined by school sports and comic books. In the morning, he ambled down the stairs, backpack slung low, greeting his parents with the casual confidence of a child who believes his happiness is guaranteed. He launched into tales of broken bases and halftime goals, oblivious to the weight his story might carry in her chest. She would mask her growing turmoil with laughter, ruffling his hair as though each giggle could somehow patch the fracture spreading in their home. Patrick's innocence felt both a sanctuary and a pang, a reminder that decisions made by adults could foreshadow consequences he could never fathom. In his world, love was simple. A mother's warm hugs and a father's encouraging nod were enough to light the sky. But as Connie watched him drift back to his school bus, she felt an ache ripple through her that scattered every plan she had ever made. Paul's invitation to that late gallery showing circuited her mind like an unfinished painting, vivid but incomplete. When Edward asked where she would be, she spoke of an old friend catching up, her tone flat and unconvincing. She reached for her keys with deliberate calm, but inside, her heart hammered against her ribs as though warning her of impending doom. When she stood on the gallery's threshold, pressed against the cold glass, she heard only the hum of lamps lining stained walls and her breath catching in her throat. She was tethered to two lives, the one Paul beckoned her toward, rich with color and danger, and the one Edward had constructed with patient devotion. In that tension, she felt wishbones break within her chest, one longing to fly, the other to remain grounded in the gentle warmth of family. In Paul's apartment, where canvases littered the hardwood floor and incense smoke curled in lazy spirals, she saw how carefully he had crafted his world. His loft, with its floor-to-ceiling windows, invited the city's noise to swirl inside, mingling with the scent of turpentine and the faint aroma of coffee he had brewed for her. She listened as he spoke of each piece on his walls, how they were snapshots of fleeting desires and unspoken confessions. His hands, stained faintly with paint, moved across each canvas as though cupping fragile life. When he drew her close, kissing her with a hunger that felt both new and astonishingly right, she closed her eyes, torn between current and shore. In his embrace, she felt a liberation that slipped through Edward's gentle hold like a phantom. And as their lips met, the world narrowed until only the two of them existed, each breath a vow that so many lines she had believed permanent were nothing more than chalk drawings on a board waiting to be erased. Edward's world came into focus like a photograph glimpsed through a pane of frosted glass. He moved through the house with remorse eking from every gesture. When he found her message that night, two simple words blinking on his phone, "Can't come," he felt his world fracture into shards. He stared at the screen until it went dark, the remaining light tracing lines of worry deeper into his face. He replayed her tone, wondered whether it had trembled. He thought of Patrick's last hug that morning, how his son's pure love felt like a tether to a world he might soon lose. He remembered the way her lips had once curved around his name with such tenderness that it felt carved into the air between them. And now, that tenderness was a memory he struggled to hold alive. Meanwhile, Paul's presence lingered long after she returned home. He left sketches of dancers in her mailbox, ink drawings so delicate they seemed to quiver as though caught mid-motion. He sent postcards of paintings he admired, turning her kitchen table into a mosaic of color that felt more stimulating than the gold and gray decor she shared with Edward. Each image he sent framed desire in fresh strokes, bold splashes of red, whispers of cobalt, pigments bleeding into one another. When she studied those postcards in the dim glow of their living-room lamp, her pulse thrummed with a new urgency, as though her heart had been given a language it could only speak in art. Edward watched her from across the table one evening as she curated a display in the bookstore's front window, the postcards swirling between her slender fingers. She arranged them around a canvas filled with impressionistic blooms, pieces he had paid for, hoping to brighten their home. He saw how her eyes flickered between each sketch and her reflection in the glass, lost to him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He felt a hollow ache press into his chest, as though his love, once boundless, had shrunk to a single point. The fear of losing her to something he could not name wrapped around him like a suffocating cord. In that moment, he realized forgiveness might not be enough to bridge the chasm that threatened to open between them. The fragility of their existence became palpable one Sunday afternoon when Patrick came down with a fever, his small frame shivering beneath a threadbare blanket. Connie hovered beside him, stroking his clammy forehead, her mind a flurry of guilt and despair. She watched Edward as he knelt to soothe Patrick, his strong arms cradling their son like a fortress. For a moment she felt envy, for the warmth he shared with his child, for the trust he offered in that soft lullaby he hummed. She wondered if she could ever find such solace again, if forgiveness could succeed in stitching together a life irrevocably torn by passion's arrow. As Edward's voice grew hoarse from repeated reassurances, Connie felt the weight of her choices press into her until she trembled. She placed a trembling hand on his shoulder, the same way she once did when they first vowed their love, and for an instant she saw in his eyes both sorrow and something profound, an echo of hope that maybe, just maybe, their bond could endure. In the days that followed, the bookstore became her sanctuary and her prison. She arranged shelves, nested new arrivals among old favorites, and helped patrons with their stacks of armfuls, each smile she offered carrying the silent ache of a soul seeking redemption. Early on, the production revealed itself to be a tapestry woven of both meticulous planning and unexpected accidents. The brownstone itself, on Quincy Street near Prince, was no mere set piece but a fully inhabited home, a relic of 19th-century craftsmanship that came draped in authenticity. When producers first approached the owner, a septuagenarian painter who kept cats and dozens of canvases stacked in every corner, they imagined relocating furniture, bringing in lights, and erecting scaffolds. Instead, they discovered a house that seemed to breathe the same air its inhabitants once had decades before. The production designer, a man named Rick, claimed he could still find faint chalk-lined arrows pointing to where a coal stove once stood and how shadows once danced across those redwood floors. To preserve that patina, he and his crew arrived at dawn each morning to photograph every nail, every crack, every ghost of yesterday, before gingerly laying boards and risers over them, so that when the cameras panned, no trace of homely disrepair would show beneath their glimmering polish. In the kitchen, where Connie Sumner, Diane Lane's character, would confront her husband in that final, shattering scene, the cupboards were carefully labeled in tiny print: Cupboard A, false backs. Cupboard B, hollowed flooring. It was for the scene when Richard Gere's Edward returned home early and discovered the lover's belongings. The illusion hinged on an intricately crafted set within a set, cabinets built to reveal hidden drawers storing handkerchiefs, scarves, and a single tube of lipstick from Olivier Martinez's character. The set carpenter, an aging craftsman nicknamed Pop, took special pride in each false front. He'd learned woodworking by hand during the Depression, he told anyone who would listen, and he refused to let modern tools cheapen his craftsmanship. A drawer should glide like a whisper, he'd say, or it's just a box with a hole. And so, in the hush before each take, he'd polish the edges again and again until they shone like the curve of a woman's smile. Across the apartment's living room, where romance and betrayal braided into every frame, the cinematographer conducted daily altar-like rituals. Patrick, the gaffer, would place a single red rose at the base of a lamp, then remove it before filming. The producers claimed it anchored the mood, that its life mirrored the fragility of Connie's love for her husband. Diane Lane discovered on the first day on set that the rose would always be wilted by dawn, as though mourning the very scenes to come. She asked no questions, smiling politely when the makeup artist dabbed a few petals into her hand, to use in her final close-up, where tear-streaked cheeks would trace that same red blossom's petals like aching memories. At the center of these elaborate preparations stood Diane Lane herself, a woman whose talent shimmered like glass in sunlight. When she arrived to rehearse that first meeting with Olivier Martinez's character, she found him already there, pacing the length of the living room with dark, intense eyes. He gave off the aura of someone born to stand under chiaroscuro, one side of his face lit in crisp white, the other falling into murk, like an unfinished painting demanding an artist's brush. A young actor fresh from film school in Paris, he barely spoke a word of English at first. To bridge the gap, Diane learned a few lines in French, simple phrases that would land when the camera rolled, but that also let him know she respected the accent of his native tongue. Rumor said that during their first read-through, she paused mid-line, asked him to repeat a word, and then laughed, genuine, clear as spring, which melted the tension in the air. He'd later say it was the moment he realized she saw him not as a character, but as a living, breathing man. In that same living room, Richard Gere moved like a carefully constructed sculpture. He arrived long before the crew, reclining on the faintly musty couch with a copy of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina in hand, an ironic choice that seemed meaningful only to him. He'd underlined a specific passage about marriage, infidelity, and forgiveness, and he'd carry that battered paperback in his coat pocket, reading sometimes between takes. The director, Adrian Lyne, recognized the parallel and began staging subtlest nods to Levin's angst when framing Gere's features. To anchor the authenticity, Lyne insisted that during the lengthy I know sequence, when Edward confesses to hitting the lover, Gere not eat anything, so that his natural exhaustion would settle into each silent beat. Crew members claimed the result was so haunting that some would later find themselves paused in the hallway, glancing over gauze bandage that Richard wore across his mouth when he wasn't acting, as though he carried Edward's guilt into real life. One of the strangest incidents occurred right before the infamous sex scene, when Connie and Paul find themselves in the car, unable to resist the pull of desire. The location was a deserted parking garage beneath a friend's brownstone, chosen for its abrasive geometry, harsh overhead lights, concrete columns, and dripping water that lent an echo. A local cat known to roam the neighborhood slipped into a drainpipe and emerged beneath the wheel wells, its green eyes glowing as trailers rolled in. Diane Lane circled the car, ensuring her nails weren't long enough to scratch the leather seats, while Olivier Martinez paced nearby, his breath visible in the chilly breeze. When cameras rolled, a single meow erupted from beneath the car, and all of them froze. Gere said he nearly dropped his book in the back seat. The crew searched in vain for what sounded like a pregnant wail, convinced the cat had been injured. Ultimately, production paused until an animal control officer arrived to rescue the cat from the concrete void. Only then did they discover the creature was perfectly fine, more interested in the warmth of spotlights than any potential peril. Diane Lane's concern for the character's authenticity extended to her costume changes, each outfit symphonic with Connie's emotional arc. She wore a slim-cut wool trench coat in the opening scene, its color a shade of charcoal so dark that it swallowed winter's gray light. That coat, custom-made and lined with silk, cost more than half the budget for the supporting cast's wardrobe. By the time Connie skirts the confrontation at the hospital, she's dressed in a blouse so pale, it nearly matches the antiseptic walls. Costumers later admitted they dripped bleach onto the hem to erase the final stubborn stains of wine that had spilled during the dinner party shoot. In that subtle shift from dark to light, every stitch seemed to echo Connie's unraveling, until she arrived at the redemption scene, where she wore a cashmere cardigan gifted by a neighbor, one dog-eared note in the pocket reminding her that forgiveness never came free. Some nights, the crew wrapped at dawn, their bodies humming with exhaustion and exhilaration. One such morning, an electrician found himself still fiddling with a flicker box beneath the living room set. The Edison bulbs themselves, 4 hanging naked from a beam, flickered and dipped in a pattern no one could replicate. They thought it was a loose wire, but after tightening every connection, they discovered the bulbs alone quivered in a coded rhythm, like a heartbeat whose pulse could not be silenced. They replaced the bulbs twice, only to find the replacements dancing to the same strange beat. Edward carried his own burdens in the raw cadence of his footsteps down the hallway, each echo a confession that their life, so carefully assembled, now teetered on the brink. He found himself standing in the kitchen long after she'd turned in for the night, staring at the postcards pinned to the bulletin board like a map of temptation. He remembered the way the art flickered in her eyes, a brilliant blaze of fascination he recognized from the early days of their courtship, yet blurred now by uncertainty and betrayal. He traced a fingertip across one of Paul's drawings of a dancer mid-twirl, his hand trembling as though he expected the ink to blur beneath his touch. In that moment, he realized forgiveness would be a struggle that demanded more of his heart than he ever imagined he could give. The turning point arrived without warning, like a thunderclap on a cloudless day. Connie returned to the gallery, drawn by a wordless need to reclaim the spark she had nearly lost. Paul waited for her there, his face shadowed by regret and longing. The gallery's hush seemed to hum with expectation, and when he stepped into her path, she saw in his eyes the same fire that had first drawn her across the threshold of fidelity's bounds. In that instant, she felt the quiver of possibility ignite within her chest, even as a chill of recognition crawled up her spine. This moment, more than any before, would define who she would become. Paul reached for her hand, brushing his thumb across her palm, a question folded into every gesture. "I love you," he whispered. "I always will." But love now wore a tarnished crown, a promise forged in shadows. Connie felt tears overwhelm her, each one a spark of remembrance and resolve. She drew back, stepping away from him with both urgency and sorrow. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice a fragmented echo of its former softness. "I can't do this." The words trembled in the gallery's hush, and for a heartbeat, Paul's world wavered, his face paling as though she had pulled a thread that unraveled every hope he'd stitched into their union. His shoulders slumped, and he closed his eyes as though swallowing a bitter pill of finality. She turned and fled, tears stinging her cheeks as she raced down the glass hall corridors, the light refracting into prisms that pained her with their beauty. She arrived home to find Edward waiting on the steps, framed in the dim glow of street lamps, as though the entire world had conspired to place him in her path. His gaze held a mixture of anguish and relief as though her betrayal had been both the wound and the salve. She collapsed into his arms, shaking as though the last barrier confining her had crumbled into dust. Edward held her as though she were the only home his heart had ever known, his arms strong beneath her unsteadiness. She knew she could not fully confide in him. Not yet, but she offered him a fragment of the truth, that her heart had wandered, but that she had chosen to return. He drew her close, and she felt the steady cadence of his heartbeat beneath her ear, a rhythm she had once taken for granted, now sounding miraculous beneath her own. In that embrace, she realized that love, though tested by flame and betrayal, remained a force that grounded her. Yet she recognized how fragile their bond now was, as delicate as glass warmed by sparks. She felt in her soul a prayer that the ache between them could become a call to deeper devotion, rather than a wound beyond repair. In the weeks that followed, they moved through a cautious dance of reparation. Conversations that began with tears and ended with small laughter, as though each moment of candor dissolved a fragment of the wall they had built between their hearts. She found herself speaking again of her longing for art, and he listened, no longer with suspicion but with wonder, his hand resting against her back as though anchoring her to the present. Their nights grew long with whispered apologies and soft touches that felt like confessionals beneath the hush of dim lamplight. And as she watched him guide Patrick through the art of forgiveness, kneeling at his son's bedside, explaining courage in terms a child could grasp, she felt her own heart reshape into something stronger, more generous, more whole. When Edward's lawyer called to rearrange the terms of his plea, she sat beside him in the living room, a single lamp painting both their faces with warmth. They spoke of consequences, the possibility of jail time, the loss of security, but she saw no fear in his eyes, only resolve, as though he had already discovered a freedom beyond the barbed wires of society's judgment. In that moment, she realized that the arc of their story had stretched beyond shame into redemption. He squeezed her hand, conveying a promise that went unspoken, that whatever came next, they would face it together, their broken trust forged into an unbreakable bond. And so, in the hush of their home, they began anew, each day a testament to love's capacity to endure. He took her to solo exhibitions she once only dreamed of visiting, and she walked beside him through museums, her hand resting on his arm like a bloom seeking sunlight. Patrick, sensing the subtle shifts, gave them eager smiles and hugs, and in his laughter they found balm for their wounds. The postcards from Paul, now tucked away in a drawer, had become silent memorials to a path not taken, relics of a lesson etched into their lives, that love's true test is not in its perfection, but in its willingness to weather storms. In this new chapter of their story, Connie carried within her the memory of how fragile and fierce love could be. She recognized that Edward had become not a mere partner, but a reflection of her soul's capacity for both despair and hope. And she understood that as they moved forward, hand in hand, they would do so with the knowledge that passion, once unleashed, could wound as deeply as it healed, yet also restore in ways only broken hearts could imagine. In the sacred hush between night and dawn, as their son slept and the house settled into silence, they stood together at the window, silhouettes stitched against the pale glow of morning. He placed his hand on her shoulder, and she felt the steady warmth beneath her trembling skin. In that gentle touch lay the promise of all that had been lost and all that might still be found. Trust reborn not from perfection, but from the quiet bravery of two hearts choosing, again and again, to rise above the shadows and dance in the light of a second chance. A slant of afternoon sunlight followed Diane Lane up the narrow fire escape of that brownstone in Soho, dappling her hair with the soft glow of late October. She climbed 2 stories with ease, the hem of her charcoal skirt grazing each iron step, never quite touching the memory of every previous actress who had labored through similar ascents. Today, though, she carried no burden of history, only a script, dog-eared and creased, in her hands. That script, titled The Unfaithful Wife in its earliest incarnation, had come all the way from Paris before landing in Adrian Lyne's hands. Rumor held that it was a near-lost French gem once directed by Claude Chabrol, but in Lyne's capable vision it would find new life among the bowers of Manhattan, a city too electrifying to hide even its deepest secrets. They replaced the bulbs twice, only to find the replacements dancing to the same strange beat. In the end, they resigned themselves to the mystery, switching bulbs on and off between takes until the film's end credits rolled. Rumor spread that the house itself refused to snap shut, that the ghosts of past inhabitants whispered in the courtyard's breath, coaxing lights to flicker and reels to roll until secrets spilled from whispered shadows. One of the most curious pieces of trivia concerns the film's soundtrack, and specifically how director Adrian Lyne managed to secure Sada's "Is It a Crime?" for the final montage. Legend states that a studio executive, head buried in spreadsheets, refused to greenlight licensing for the track, arguing that it cost way too much for a romantic drama. Lyne, determined that his hero's final realization of guilt needed the song's weary, layered vocals, flew to London with a copy of the script tucked under his arm. He met with Sada's manager in a cramped office filled with framed awards and champagne corks. The manager, a man with the bearing of a seasoned diplomat, refused his briefcase, setting it aside on a plush sofa as if to say, "We see through facades here." Lyne explained, passionately, why the song mattered, how its lyrics of irrevocable betrayal and faded devotion mirrored Connie's journey. The manager studied the script in silence before asking only one question: "Will you make her hurt the way these words bleed?" Lyne nodded, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. The manager smiled, and by sunrise he had drafted a contract. In the morning light, Lyne returned to New York with that precious license. By nightfall, the studio's objection had been quietly withdrawn, as though the song's power transcended the power of dollars. Then there was the iconic shot of Richard Gere sitting alone on the stoop of that brownstone, framed in blue dusk just after Connie's confession. Adrian Lyne wanted that image to feel as though Edward might crumble into the pavement beneath his feet. To achieve that effect, the cinematographer rigged an overhead crane rig so high he worried the camera might topple if a gust of wind whipped through the courtyard. On the morning of the shoot, the wind howled exactly as they rolled cameras, an anxious gale that buffeted the rig so fiercely it threatened to collapse under the strain. Ladders clattered, cables snapped taut, and crew members ducked for cover as the first take began. Gere, seated on the stoop in a charcoal suit that felt too formal for the moment, stared into the empty street, clutching a folded letter in one hand. The letter was a folded piece of rigged paper, 10 pages that read, "Forgive me," in Conan O'Brien's looping script. When the wind ripped it from his grip and scattered the sheets down the sidewalk, the inadvertent effect was so perfectly aligned with Edward's heartbreak that Lyne kept the take. Gere's eyes flicked up to track each fluttering page as though he'd just shot a scene in which the last vestiges of hope tore to the wind. They went on to shoot 5 more takes, but none held the same fragile magic. When the wind finally died down and they reset the shot, it felt marred by quiet knowledge, like a forced apology missing its raw urgency. Olivier Martinez's entrance into Hollywood's orbit came with its share of oddities. He arrived for wardrobe fittings with an entourage of 3 translators and a single violinist, unannounced. The violinist would finger the strings of her Stradivarius in the corner of the fitting room, a single, mournful tune played so softly it seemed to echo from a distant cathedral. Martinez claimed that music cleared his mind, even when he knew no one could hear it. One morning, a customer dared to ask the violinist to stop, claiming she was shaking the seams of the expensive garments on the rack. The violinist merely smiled and played a single high note that pierced the air, sending goosebumps rippling across the customer's arms. She fell silent, and the violinist continued, as though the melodies themselves were a part of the fabric. Later, Martinez admitted he had no idea the violinist would be accompanying him. He simply found the sound calming when bracing for passion's portrayal. The crew took it as a sign that his arriving world carried more poetry than pragmatism, that his presence in Squadron Avenue's steely confines would always feel like a waltz whispered at midnight. In the early dailies, editors discovered an anomaly that seemed to defy explanation. In several sequences, when shots cut from Connie's face to the rearview mirror reflecting Paul's image, a faint smudge appeared, like a ghostly handprint, on the mirror's glass. They tried wiping it away, but it returned with every new take of a nearly identical scene. Some whispered that Pop the set carpenter had left a fingerprint in the silvery coating when polishing the mirror, but lab tests on the glass revealed nothing. No residue, no partial arches of a print. It vanished entirely when a fresh mirror was swapped in, yet persisted in the digital renderings of those initial dailies, ghost-like. On one record-level night, the studio's projectionist swore he saw the smudge shift, its edges curling into a shape that resembled a tangled vine, before fading like cigarette smoke on the screen. They never quite explained it, and over time it became one of the film's whispered signatures of mystery. The belief that some fingerprints, whether on glass or heart, refuse to vanish even when time and reason demand otherwise. When it came time to shoot the pivotal sequence in which Connie's red Loewe gloves slipped from her hand in the rain-soaked lobby of that chic Manhattan hotel, rain machines inundated the set with torrents so relentless that crew members began sending words home on coffee-stained napkins. "Bring a change of pants." Lights flickered as though caught in a fever dream, and the floors became rivers, sending lens operators and grips sliding while viewers on monitors watched the world dissolve into water behind Connie's blurred silhouette. She and Olivier Martinez rehearsed the motion of that single glove, a crimson flash against the downpour, until they found a rhythm that felt both desperate and precise. On the day of the final take, the water pressure spiked, sending a jet of spray so forceful that Diane Lane's gutters pressed into the carpet in a swirl of water and mud. She braced herself against the lobby's reception desk, a prop carefully constructed to look like marble but, to her horror, made of waterproofed masonite. She slipped. The cameraman, panning in a tight 60mm frame, captured her fall, an unplanned slice of raw emotion that shot through her eyes before she recovered. Lyne shouted, "Cut!" But the footage was already golden. The unguarded shock in her face as she felt the cold flood for a split second shone with the very vulnerability Connie's desperate actions required. They kept it in the final cut, echoing through theaters as viewers gasped at the sudden fracture of theatrical illusion. Perhaps the oddest anecdote came from the editing suite, where the film's conclusion found its eternal cadence. Adrian Lyne inspected each pair of frames, searching for the precise moment Richard Gere's Edward realized the full measure of his guilt. The studio's original mandate had demanded a conventional resolution, perhaps a fade to black or a glimpse of Connie committing to a freshly mended life. Lyne insisted on something more haunting, the final freeze frame.